Good evening, and welcome to the latest events of TimesTalks DC. I'd also like to welcome the national and international audiences who are watching us on nytimes.com and on Facebook Live. This is going to be a very special evening. We have a great panel for you. We're going to be talking about the press and the challenges of covering Trump's Washington, which we all know here on the stage firsthand. You'll be meeting Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the Times, and my boss. He is the former Washington bureau chief, and he has done an astonishing job of transforming the New York Times into a digital publication while still keeping print going. He's an inspiration. You'll also be meeting Peter Baker, our chief White House correspondent, who covers the presidency like no one else. When Trump was elected, we brought Peter back from Jerusalem. He was that important. You'll also hear from Maggie Haberman, the Trump whisperer, who understands Trump like no one else. I learn more from Maggie in 5 minutes in the morning when I talk to her than I do for the rest of the week. She is amazing. And then you're also going to hear from Jim Rutenberg, our moderator, who is our fantastic media columnist, a former political reporter in the Washington Bureau, a great company. We all miss him. We wish he were still in Washington. So just please welcome me, please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you to people watching on Facebook Live. Just a little housekeeping. We're going to talk for like 55 minutes or an hour, which is no problem for this crowd. You can't shut these people up. And then we'll take questions both on Facebook Live and here. There'll be a microphone. I also want to thank Elizabeth Buehmiller for sticking me with the job of interviewing our boss. Thank you, like any good bureau chief. I was going to say this is a great week to have this panel, but every week is a great week to have this panel. But this week I'll start with my favorite quote of the week, or maybe not favorite. It's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write whatever they want to write. People should look into it. And Dean, I'm wondering if you have looked into it. Do you know who that quote was from?
I do. I will go range look into it. I mean, I don't have to say that I think that that's a disturbing quote, because essentially, if you listen to it closely, what he's saying is the press shouldn't be able to write what it wants to write. And that's disturbing because I'm not sure any president from any party in my lifetime, except I guess Richard Nixon, but I'm not sure he would have said it so clearly and publicly, has challenged. They may not have liked the press. I think a lot of times Barack Obama did not like the press. In fact, I've never been involved with covering a president, a governor, or a mayor who truly loved the press. But I'm not sure I've seen someone who so vocally challenged the press's right to cover him and the world as this president. So that's a disturbing quotation.
Do you take it, though, as, and this should go to everybody here, it's 10 months in, we've heard this talk a lot. Where do we draw that? How seriously do you take the talk? Because there's a point where the rubber meets the road. So for Maggie and Peter, has anything happened to keep you from doing your job? And though there's an effect of the words.
Yeah, that's the line I would draw, where I would be more concerned. I don't care about the name calling. The name calling is part of the shtick. It's part of the environment. It's the surround sound of this presidency. Fine, we're big boys and big girls, and we can take it. What would be disturbing is if that then trails into actual changes in our ability to do our job. And what the president said yesterday wasn't just, it's discussing they can write what they want. What he said was we should take away licenses from broadcasters who publish or print or broadcast things that they don't agree with. That is more disturbing. Now, he doesn't seem to understand the system. The networks don't actually get licensed by the federal government the way he seems to think they do. But they do have stations that do, and you can obviously cause a lot of trouble if you want. And it's also arguable a chilling effect. So that's where I would draw the line, is where it comes to affect our jobs. I don't know about Maggie. I have not seen anything that's affected my particular job, other than like the day they wouldn't let, I think, Glenn Thrush into a briefing one time. But for the most part, we've actually, I think, not experienced.
That was its own thing. No, we really haven't. I mean, there hasn't been a shutting down at all. And if anything, in terms of, the irony is that in terms of FOIA responses, they're actually faster than what we've seen in certain things in the past. The thing that I would say, because so much of trying to understand what he's doing, I agree with everything you've said, except for one thing, which is that I don't think it's just shtick. And I've thought about this a lot today on my way here.
I don't think it's just shtick.
No, but I'm actually going somewhere further than that. Jim and I both used to work at the New York Post, and the New York Post was the newspaper, and I love the New York Post, and it gave me my career, but the New York Post is a newspaper that Trump had a deeply transactional relationship with, and when Trump began to sort of understand government was when he was a real estate developer in New York City in the 80s, where laws and regulations existed to be gotten around if you were doing a building. And in his mind, media was something that you built. So I think he truly does not understand what the basic role of the media is, which is by no means an excuse. And I think that he does find this to be useful to some extent. His supporters clearly like it. He was urged on by Stephen Bannon to keep doing it. And the danger, I think, is not just in terms of our ability to get information from them, but the question is how dangerous it becomes for reporters in general, right? I mean, I think that there have been an increase in threats against people. I think you are seeing people's home addresses being published on websites and so forth. So while Trump enjoys it to some extent, he doesn't hate the media, so it never really quite works. But a lot of his supporters are not really in on the joke, and I think that's where it becomes a problem.
Right, and
the challenge for us, I'm sorry, is that I think we almost have to cover him we have to deal with him on two levels. There's the level of, I mean, as somebody who cares deeply about journalism, and that journalism survives for a long time, and that journalism is respected. I feel the need to question his criticisms and push back at his criticisms. But as somebody who's responsible for covering him, which obviously the two of them are, the three of you are more, I have a different role, which is to take that part of me, put it over here and just cover him aggressively, but with fairness as the President of the United States.
And to be fair on his comment yesterday, he was angry at a particular report that he says was inaccurate. So if you can interpret his comment as it's disgusting that the media is able to write unfair, untrue things, they shouldn't write unfair, untrue things. He didn't say it exactly quite that way.
The problem is he often says that things that are true aren't true. And
Yeah.
so I think that's where this becomes a distinguishing line.
And how much is that? I mean, so Dean, from your point, to me it would raise two things, right? There's the safety of your reporters, which I wonder if you were more worried about your reporters in the campaign. Was it a little hotter in the campaign, or is it just as hot now? And then secondarily, do you need to do more to defend your journalism? Because your journalism is being questioned from, when it's true, it's being questioned from the very top of our government.
I worry about I worried more during the campaign, but I also still worry. I mean, there's no question this president has turned up the rhetoric. Whether he believes it or not is an interesting issue, but he's turned up the rhetoric very powerfully. And that makes me anxious about the safety of my reporters. It was worse when New York Times reporters were in rallies where the president was encouraging a sort of angry discourse. So that yes, I'm remain anxious about it, but I was more anxious about it during the campaign.
I wasn't worried until Elizabeth Buemiller put a red button next to my desk. Told me it was a panic button.
I saw that.
Which is true. It's true. There's now a panic button next to my desk.
I never felt so safe sitting by the Port Authority.
I thought, okay, editors are coming, push the button. No, obviously it's something we have to think about. But your point about defending the journalism, though, is right. And I think the best defense of our journalism is getting the story and getting the story right. And I think that it's incumbent on us to make sure our stories are, this is a bad adjective, but bulletproof, because in fact, any small error is going to give ammunition to somebody to say, aha, that means everything is wrong. So our most important mission right now is to make sure our journalism is as strong and correct and accurate, professional and airtight as it possibly could be.
Right, because does it feel like every time he attacks a story as false and the story is proven true, are we seeing a cumulative effect where it's helping, where our journalism seems to be sticking more, that it matters more?
I mean, I'll twist twist it a little bit.
That's how they operate, editors.
I always think it's not story by story. You have to take the long view. And the long view is if you are always, or as always as you can possibly be, accurate in your aggressive reporting about any subject, and your reporting turns out to be true, which I believe is the case with the New York Times, your credibility inevitably will go up. Even if at the moment there's criticism, and even if at the moment, day to day, there are attacks, I just think you have to keep your eye on the long ball, which is, if you want to use the most profound example of that, if you look back at whether it's the Washington Post coverage of Watergate, where they were attacked daily, or if you look back at the way newspapers covered the civil rights movement, where they were attacked daily, I think history, in both cases, proved the institutions that did that right. I think history treated them well, and that's the way I look at it.
And people forget that, the Watergate story was not clean and simple. Oh. They made huge mistakes.
They made huge mistakes. They were on deadline.
Not many, though, in fairness to them.
Well, you're a former Washington Post
I am.
No, you're right. Not you.
But they made one particular big mistake. But even in that case, that was an interesting case because they said that a Nixon aide had testified to John Mitchell controlling the secret fund to the grand jury. Well, the aide did know that. The grand jury didn't ask him that. So they got the process wrong, but the essential story was right. And that's important, therefore, that we get the process of the story right, not just the essence of it.
It wasn't the mistakes. Again, I think what people forget is that stories unfold in sort of mysterious ways. You don't know how they're going to end. They feel incremental. They're story by story, and they were attacked. Other news organizations ignored them. It felt easy to ignore. Who are these two guys? No. But boy, did history prove them right?
Right. Can I ask Peter, Maggie, what is it like when you are at a rally and the President of the United States says, look at them back there, the worst people in the world, the quotes go on and on. Is it as uncomfortable being there as it seems on television from afar?
It hasn't been, for me, for the very few rallies that I've covered during his presidency, because he's done very few rallies, right. It's been markedly different than it was during the campaign. It's not fun, but it is what it is. It's not really that different than the comment section on Twitter, frankly. It's just really loud and all at once. During the campaign, it was more intense, and it was especially more intense at the end of the campaign when all of the predictions really were that he was going to lose. And you had tremendous frustration and anger among his supporters. I don't find it that bad now.
Right. Peter, do you feel the same way? You're coming because you weren't there for the
I wasn't during the campaign, so I can't make a comparison. Obviously it can get kind of ugly. You go to these rallies, and again, I don't know what it was like during the campaign, and they, in some of the angrier rallies, they suddenly you find yourself with several hundred people turning around and shouting at you in unison, and sometimes pointing at you and saying, F you kind of stuff. That's a little, disturbing. But again, it is what it is. I haven't felt personally threatened. It's unfortunately a symptom of the anger in American politics today.
Yes.
It goes beyond just us.
I would add one thing to that, though. The only rally that I can think of that felt really similar to the campaign that he's done so far was Arizona, Phoenix, right. And I don't even remember now what the specific thing he was upset about.
Ages ago.
But there was something, that was where he pardoned Arpaio, and it feels like it was years ago, but it was, he was very angry at the media that night, and a lot of the crowd reaction really does depend on how much whipping up he's doing, and we saw that throughout the campaign. His tone has tended to be, it's certainly not been presidential at these rallies, but it has not historically, what we think of as presidential, but it has not been as intense as it has been during the campaign, except for that one. So it is certainly there and can happen, but I haven't seen much of it.
Do you all think he's angry, or is it a shtick?
That night he was very angry. You know what that was? That was the night, I'll answer that question in 1 second, but that was the night that Alex Burns and Jonathan Martin reported about his feud with Mitch McConnell. And the story broke when he was on Air Force One. He didn't read it. They were trying to keep it from him. And it flashed on TV on Air Force One. And that was the event after which, or around that time, and Glenn Thrush and I reported this, that Kelly had told somebody that he had never been talked to that way in 35 years and didn't anticipate being around that long if it happened. As for your other question, I think that he's tempestuous. I think that's how he was when he was at his company. that's how he is now. He's a 71-year-old man. I don't expect him to do things differently.
Peter, can I get
Sign the check.
The boss on the panel.
tempestuous or a shtick? I mean, I'm sorry, angry at the press or a shtick?
Well, I think it's both. I don't. We've had this debate, and I think that we should stop making it an either or, because I think it's a mix. I think he genuinely has grievances against the press. He genuinely looks at the papers and the TV and gets mad at what he sees. He thinks it doesn't either A, doesn't think it reflects reality, or B, he just thinks he doesn't get enough credit, or that it's just relentlessly negative. Fair enough. That's, again, as you say, other presidents don't like their coverage either. And then it is also shtick because it is also useful. Remember, I've never seen anybody lose votes by attacking the press. Surefire winner, especially on the Republican side, but probably both sides, to say that press is terrible and they're out to get us. And it gives an alternative explanation to supporters for why things might not be happening the way they would like them to happen. And that why are they talking about Russia so much? Well, it's because the press has made it up.
Right. But Peter and I have covered the Bush administration together, and we had been through this, and this, I imagine, is very different. And I'm going to segue into a Trump whisperer question. But there's a story, sorry, Maggie, like any great reporter does not want the story to be about her, which I get. But there's a fun story within our newsroom, and you can tell me if this is true or not, is that Maggie comes in from the campaign. The Washington Bureau is now taking ownership of the story. That's how it works for us, that there's a campaign team, and once the person gets elected, the team changes a little bit and comes to Washington. And as I understand it, Maggie came in like from the front, for the new troops, like to describe, here's what this is like, and this is going to be very different.
She had a great flak vest.
Yeah.
The helmet was a little scuffed.
A little bit, and it was a little too small. But
paint the scene for me. No, but how was that? And Peter, what were you like receiving the new information?
Were you there for that?
No, I was in Jerusalem where I actually had a black vest.
I was going to say, you were having real threats.
Right.
It was Ashley Parker, our former colleague, and me, and we had talked to both Bill Hamilton, one of our editors, and Elizabeth, who you heard from before, about coming and doing a briefing. I had a conversation with Mark Mazzetti, one of our national security editors, about what to expect, and I think he was a little jarred. There was a conversation that we should have a bigger meeting. And I didn't tape it, and I really wish I had, because Ashley and I periodically talk about wishing that we try to recall what we said. And I think most of what we said generally holds true still, which is that, he will say whatever he has to say to get through 10 minutes of time. A lot of what you think is strategy is not a strategy. And that is still, I think, something that people are really struggling with. He will tell you this thing you are sitting on is a table and be adamant about it. That you have to be very careful what you say to him, because he will take it and he will distort it and present it in a different way, which you saw Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee experience the other day, where there had been a conversation about him being the Secretary of State, but he had by no means asked for the job or begged for it, and that is how the president portrayed it on Twitter. He treats everything like it's a negotiation or some deal he's trying to strike. And then I think the other thing I said, and this I've said throughout the year, he is always selling you. I mean, so when he's talking to you, yes, sometimes it's because he enjoys your company, but more often than not, it's because he wants something from you. And whether that want is approval, or whether that want is, he's hoping you will write a good story about him, or whether it is, who knows what, but there is always some sales job going on. It is just fundamentally who he is.
And I would follow up on that. I would pick up on that exact point, which I think is very smart, a smart insight, and segue back to Dean's question about, is it shtick or is it real? Mm-hmm. And again, I think it's both. But I've been at a rally where he's attacked us. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Press is bad, fake media, all this kind of stuff. And it comes across as very visceral, right? And then you're with him on the plane on the way back. Hey guys, how'd it go? Did you like it? How was that? Everybody doing well?
Yep.
He's like a valet. He's like the valet, coming in. Everybody okay? Everybody got what you need?
It's really important.
And like, whoa, wait a second. Wait, didn't you just say we're terrible people? And, he believes it. It's not that he doesn't believe it, but he can shift by the moment.
He believes what he's, at that moment, he becomes convinced that, I think, and again, I'm not, I don't want to put him on the couch too much here, but, my sense has always been that he believes that what he is saying is true at the moment, or convinces himself it's true, even if on some level he knows it isn't. But to Peter's point, he came back to the back of the plane on his very quick trip to France, which he went for Bastille Day, which he literally went to because it was a fun parade. That was the main reason for this trip.
He wants
and
a parade
and he
like
said
that.
it. Now he
Great
wants
parade,
him. Yeah, and he said it to us in the Oval.
We're going to have it Pennsylvania
down
Avenue.
Pennsylvania Avenue. But he came back to the press cabin, which is pretty tiny, for an hour. And that was unusually long. But he does enjoy sort of, some of it is that he likes kind of poll testing and seeing what you thought of him. But the other important aspect of him, and you really picked up on it with what you just said about the how are you doing, are you comfortable valet aspect. The happiest I have ever seen him is honestly when he was at Mar-a-Lago, because he's sort of relaxed and he's playing greeter, and it's like he's hosting a big party. And there are aspects of this job that I think he thought were going to be like that. I think the governing piece has been a challenge.
Right. Well, that's not that big of a...
It's a small part of the job, so it doesn't really matter.
But Dean, for you as you've got to make decisions on how we weight the coverage, and this debate's been going on for a long time now. I'm wondering if it's almost settled at this point, because we've done big, important investigative work. But how do you weigh, how important do you make a story like the President of the United States threatening the broadcast license of NBC?
I think you give it a lot of weight. I don't think we're anywhere near, and I don't think we'll get to the point where when he tweets a threat or just tweets anything, we don't think it's a story. I mean, I think that that would be, to me, horrific. I'm actually, and you will get different answers from different people in the newsroom, to be honest. I think his tweets are important stories. I think they're not only important stories because he says things, and even if somebody else comes back the next day and his press secretary and walks it back 20 steps, I still think they're important stories. There's statements from the president.
This is the most, in this way at least, and maybe no other, but in this way at least, it's the most transparent presidency we have had in our lifetime, maybe ever. Because
it's like watching Robert Caro unfold in real time.
It's real time.
You say the Nixon tapes.
It's like the Nixon tapes if they were played every night on the CBS News, right? It's like you've got to actually hear what the president's thinking. You have the most transparent window into his mentality, what he's thinking at this very moment. It may not be
even if he's the next day, or even if somebody, it's a remarkable.
Right.
That's
right.
And
this is the stuff you write books about 2 years later, right?
And the disparity between what he says and then what his aides say an hour later is important to understand how this White House works and how how they're struggling to find a path forward.
But why? Yeah, and I guess for the people who say A, that they're not stories, but B, there's always been a pretty loud clamor. Why isn't Twitter shutting him down? I mean, among other things, he's the president of the United States. But why wouldn't you want to know what he's thinking?
Yes.
I'd much rather know what he's thinking as opposed to a sanitized version.
That's right.
Yes.
But the interesting thing about Twitter is it, first of all, feels like he has pulled, he's pulled the debate onto Twitter with the media.
Oh, he has.
Yeah.
And you guys are in that mix every day, and his supporters, some of them might be Russian bots, who even knows, right, are attacking. And I've seen reporters kind of try to engage him on Twitter. One of our colleagues, Glenn Thrush, declared recently, I'm off Twitter. And I'm wondering if you two have been tempted to do the same.
I'm off this whole week. I've been off it.
That's news, right? Maggie is
Maggie
off
Haberman's
Twitter
off.
for a week.
Apparently not that much news. You didn't know.
No, I heard it before. I was eliciting an answer. I'm learning how to be a performer.
She's on a cleanse right now. It's a cleanse.
It is a cleanse. I'm doing the Twitter juice diet. No, I don't. It's a really important medium. It is in a lot of ways. It is also a really distracting medium. And you can end up spending, what it has become for a lot of people, and I don't mean reporters actually, I just mean like the world, and frankly, a lot of it is operatives and people in the White House on the government payroll. It's like the anger video game. People just get on it and they just want to yell. And it's like, what is the point of this? And so it was making me a little crazy. And I have my phone very close to my bed, so close it's like in my bed at night, and I have all these Twitter alerts, and I was finding myself waking up every hour and a half and checking the phone. I'm like, I can't live like this. This is insane. So I got off of it, and I got to be honest with you, I'm not, like, I still have the app on my phone, but I'm not obsessively doing this.
You look better.
Thank you. If something happens, usually someone will flag it. It's when Trump did his Bob Corker Fest last Sunday, an editor emailed all of us. I was aware of it instantly. What I think that Twitter has been so useful for Trump for is that one of the things Trump does, and this was a huge success for him during the campaign, and it is so much less of a success for governing, is he turns everything into an up or down referendum on himself. And so he's very able to use Twitter for that. Everything becomes about whether you are with him or against him. And because Twitter is 140 characters, it's incredibly black and white. I don't find it that useful for most other stuff.
And Peter, did you kind of mix it up in Twitter with him as much? Not as much, right? Or have you been?
No, I don't get involved in. I use Twitter.
You're very good about it.
I use Twitter as just presenting stories that I've either written or read or colleagues have written or so forth, just things that I'm interested in, and I try to do it just like as if they're headlines. And I don't, for the most part, every once in a while.
You engage people very respectfully.
Every once in a while,
even
I
when you're in an
try.
argument.
Sometimes when people, the only time I engage generally was where people I think people have a factual misunderstanding.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I try to say, this is actually just what the facts are.
But you're very respectful about it.
People are so reasonable on Twitter. Once you just reason logic, they get it.
Sometimes it works.
It's so easy.
It does work
It's
sometimes.
like therapy. It actually does.
Well, it was interesting, actually, before Twitter, we had clickable bylines at the Washington Post, and I don't know if we still, anyway, and people could send you emails on your stories. And I don't get nearly many these days because of Twitter, but in the old days, I would get up to 200 per story. Yeah. I made a real point of trying to get back to as many of those as I possibly could, except for the ones who were virulently scatological or racist or anti-Semitic or something. But the ones, even the ones who were really super angry and really, even visceral. And I found that about 2/3 of the time, if you gave them a respectful answer and say, look, I understand why you're saying this point you made is actually in the story, or my colleague wrote this piece, or actually we found that wasn't true, and this is the reason we wrote our story this way, or the headline, or it was really my editors who took that out, which is the biggest thing.
Blame it all on the
I would say 2/3 of the time.
No one's ever said that except for you. Yeah.
2/3 of the time, people would get
to
back.
blame?
Yeah. They would get back and say, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, or I'm still angry, but thank you so much. I mean, people expect us to be a big monolithic institution.
That's right.
And the media is not. There's no such thing as the media. It's a whole lot of little medias and a whole lot of individuals who are doing their job and doing them differently.
That's true.
Right.
Dean, how have you felt about Twitter? I think I know the answer. It's another one of those questions where I can know the answer, but how have you felt about it, especially with the non-political staff when they kind of wade into this? And I think...
Right. First, I have never been that engaged in Twitter, but I was deeply engaged in Facebook. And I found that I sort of pulled out after I called a professor a name that I won't.
Oh, yes. I remember the name. It wasn't even that bad.
No, it wasn't.
Not in today's context.
It wasn't as bad.
Yeah.
It wasn't as bad as it should have been.
You could say it. I think you can say it on ABC in prime time now.
But
It's true, I think.
I feel pretty strongly that that New York Times journalists should not be able to say anything on social media that they cannot say either in the pages or in any of the platforms of the New York Times.
Good luck with that.
I know, but
That's true.
I have spent.
It is
I have
true, though.
spent
And readers make
full
no
days.
distinction.
I've spent full days policing our social media. I've spent weekends.
So you'll call reporters and be like, "What are you
called
doing?"
reporters. I've sent notes to reporters. And I think it's difficult, but it shouldn't be as difficult. Here's my view, and I feel strongly and will continue to push it. We are doing extraordinarily aggressive reporting about this administration, partly because it's a transformational administration, partly because it's raising questions we've never contemplated before, from a president who continues to do some business in his office to a White House that looks like unlike any other White House. If I'm going to do that, if the New York Times is going to do that, I need to have the rest of my house in order, which means I need to be able to say, and the two of them need to be able to say to the world, we're doing this because it's journalistically sound, we're not doing this because we have a vendetta or we're trying to take him out. And I can't do that if I have 100 people working for the New York Times sending inappropriate tweets. I know this is not just an issue for the New York Times, this is an issue for the media in general, and we're gonna come up with a tougher policy. But it's just really important. I know it's hard for people because we are in a moment. I'm trying to think what it would have been like to run a newspaper during the Civil Rights Movement or during the Vietnam War, when you had look, newspaper staffs are human beings. Right. I mean, they're made up of people who are human, and the temptation, whether they're from the left or the right, to jump into debates is a very powerful temptation in America. But I have to make the staff resist that in order to be able to look everybody in the eye and say these two people are doing their work objectively and clearly.
Because the mission's got to be bigger than...
The mission's got to be bigger than you're getting mad over a glass of wine at 9 o'clock at night and wanting to send somebody a text.
Not that you're thinking of anything in particular. I do think, though, that, I think that that's a big part. I think as we're talking about Trump, we're talking about his frustrations with the media, shtick or real, and I do think, I agree with Peter totally, the two things are true at once. But where I do think that he has a legitimate complaint, and I just mean with the broad arena of coverage, a lot of it is compounded by Twitter, but the tone, I think, is not helpful a lot of the times, and I think Twitter just is like pouring acid on that. I think that one of the problems of campaign coverage, again, across the board for everyone, was that there was a lot of telling and not showing. And I think that it's really important that we just sort of show, and people can make up their minds for themselves.
And that brings me to something that happened this week for us, and it's along the same lines, and that was that James O'Keefe, the sort of guerrilla conservative filmmaker, captured someone who was portrayed as being a very senior level boss at our newspaper, saying, I am biased, and I'm, what is he, related to Comey? I'd never met the guy. Maybe he's a boss. I need to go find him and,
I have a,
fill us in on that.
I have a lot of thoughts about this. For those of you who saw it, it was an undercover operation in which James O'Keefe, who I think is a despicable person who runs a despicable operation, he essentially tries to catch people from what he sees as the left-wing media saying inappropriate things. He caught a kid, a guy in his 20s, who, to give you an idea, they portray him as a very powerful figure in the New York Times. I'd never met him.
When did he start?
He started 6 months ago. And he has a very entry-level job at the New York Times. And he said things he shouldn't have said. And he said things that, were damaging, and I will deal with that. But the greater sin wasn't his, it was theirs. They sent a young woman in as part of their undercover operation who essentially made him think that he was developing a friendship. He said really stupid stuff. He said he was Jim Comey's godson. He said he had once worked undercover. Essentially, he said stuff he shouldn't have said. But his sin was a sin of foolishness, and it violated our policies. Their sin was greater. Their sin was a sin of lying and subterfuge, and they're just awful.
For a purpose,
For a purpose, to ding the New York Times, they went after a kid who just started his career in journalism. To ding the New York Times, they went after a kid, and they probably affected his career forever. That's despicable. So, yes, he committed a sin, and I'll deal with that. I was raised Catholic. That's a venial sin. I was an altar boy. Their sin is a mortal sin.
Right. I was kind of Quaker Jewish. Anyway.
Different over here.
But Peter or Maggie, and again, this is a question I know the answer to, but if you had heard a colleague, I don't know if people understand this, if you had heard a colleague speaking like that to one of you, I'm here to be biased, and you are what would your reaction be?
Well, I've never heard anything like that. The truth is, I understand the whole bias question. I get it. I understand. First of all, we have a newspaper whose editorial page happens to be liberal. And therefore, there's a natural assumption, and I get why people think that must therefore automatically bleed into the pages. I had a very senior White House official one time, not this administration, tell me, you can't tell me that it doesn't affect your opinion what's on the editorial page every day when you write your story. I'm like, not like I tell you that. I can swear on a stack of Bibles, I don't read it.
Same.
Which I don't. I don't read our editorials. No offense to our great editorial writers. I make a point of not reading our editorials. Same. If it were up to me, we wouldn't have editorials because I think it confuses readers into thinking that we are a liberal paper. I don't consider myself to be a liberal. I don't think most people I work with consider themselves to be particularly ideological. I don't hear them express ideological opinions. I hear them express journalistic opinions, like we ought to do this story. This is an important story. This is an important target for scrutiny. This is an important mission for us. If we are biased toward conflict, and that's a reasonable debate to have in our industry, how much we are overly wedded to that. But, and I'm not going to deny that more reporters are probably more liberal than there are who are conservative in their private lives. But the ones I know at the New York Times are as professional as they come.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, and to Peter's point, I've never heard somebody say something like that. I do think if I did hear somebody say something like that, and I'd be stunned if I did, because we are working with professionals. And what stuck out to me was the opposition party statement. Like, no, that is not what we are, and I would address that. I think that I agree with Peter. The only editorial page I read is the Wall Street Journal, and it's because I just want to understand what is in the mind of Rupert Murdoch, who advises the president. That is why that's why I read it. And you can usually kind of tell it as a bit of a weather vane. But I think that we try to play this straight down the middle. And frankly, I mean, going back to Twitter, but on any given day, if you look at Twitter, which admittedly I'm not doing this week that much, but if you do, I doubt it's changed in a week this much. We are either in Hillary's pocket or in Trump's pocket. And because 2016 is still going on, P.S., so it's not actually ended. But I think that is a mark of us being pretty straight.
Right, Dean, this whole debate, I mean, even so a video comes forward like that, and you could see how a lot of people don't understand what we do and where we come from. And I don't think we do a good job of telling or showing how we work. Do you worry that is fake news kind of breaking through in a way because people don't understand what goes into real journalism?
I think that we have historically done a really bad job of explaining what we do and how we work. I think we did it partly because for much of my career, we made so much money. Newspapers made so much money.
Those are the best days.
Think of these things, yes, they were.
The expense account stories.
And I think we developed this sort of secret language that we thought everybody understood. The first time I walked, when I was the editor of the LA Times, the first time I walked into a readership survey and I heard what people, when we would put a dateline, a dateline from some war-torn country where a reporter had risked his life to get there and cover it, and somebody said, I thought that just meant you made phone calls there. I was sick. I think we have not done a good enough job saying, we are in the world, which is why I've pushed people to do more first person. If you look at the story this morning on the front page of the New York Times about the Rohingya crisis, and 2 or 3 times in the story the writer uses the word I.
Yes.
And I encourage that because what he's saying is, I saw this, I witnessed this, I am here. That dateline is not enough. I don't think we've done a good enough job telling people we're there, we are hard on ourselves, we debate our ethics, we have conversations about how to keep the newsroom focused and on target. I've never seen an institution more than a newspaper that more wrestles with these sort of existential issues. And I think I'd like to throw the doors open and just let people know we're doing that. I think that will help us.
One thing to your point about people not understanding, I mean, if you look at the WikiLeaks John Podesta emails that were critical of reporters, myself included, it was routine process, just completely devoid of context, and people don't understand the way this works. One thing where I thought one of our competitors, David Fahrenthold, was incredibly effective last year was he would document everything he was doing on Twitter. As opposed to doing what you would normally do, which is sort of you wouldn't get your phone calls returned and you'd have nowhere to explain that and to keep people updated. It was a really smart transparency move because people couldn't really question, well, is there some murky sausage making going on? It was just very upfront. And I think that, I mean, obviously there was a unique fact set because he was covering Trump's lack of charitable donations, and not everything cannot be that way, but I thought that was a pretty estimable goal.
The greatest, if you know what I'm saying, the greatest economic transformation of American journalism that I'm not sure people have wrapped their minds around is that journalism is now dependent on readers, and it used to be dependent on advertisers. And when it was dependent on advertisers, I mean, when I started in journalism, when I first started at the New York Times in the 90s as a reporter, 80% of the revenue came from advertising. Now, more than half the revenue comes from readers, from subscribers. That I would much prefer being beholden to subscribers than to advertisers. And it also means that we suddenly have to respond to the audience, not in a clickbait way, but we have to be much more open and say, here's how we're doing things. You should read us because we're doing this stuff.
Do you feel, in that same vein, we cut our ombudsman role, public editor. Do you feel, and I felt like when you announced it, you didn't know.
The publisher's decision.
The publisher's, okay.
She worked for the
Yes,
publisher.
thank you for correction.
No, which is important. Which is an important
Fake
distinction
news,
because the public editor often beat me up, and that's the way it should be.
So how do you feel? Do you miss the public editor, or do you?
Sometimes at night,
No, do you think
I'd cry a tear not having somebody who makes a living beating me up. No, I miss that. I said I was raised Catholic. Right?
Do you think, do you think it was ultimately, like, how do you feel about how's the decision working out? And then there's a real-time case I want to bring up.
I think that it really wasn't my decision. It was the publisher's
Right.
decision. The public editor works for the publisher. I think it was an
Were you slipping notes under the door? Like, hints?
No, I think we had some really good public editors who did important stuff. But I think that we're now at the point, the public editor system was created when people did not have a way to criticize their newspaper. And it was a result of the Jason Blair scandal, where, as it turned out, when people investigated, there were tons of people who knew Jason Blair was making stuff up, and they didn't have a way to get through the bureaucracy of the New York Times. If Jason Blair happened today, within 2 seconds, Twitter would explode, and everybody he stole stuff from would be all over the place. I think we actually now have a different kind of ombudsman, which is the public. That's the first thing. And the second thing is the downside of a public editor, and there were a lot of upsides too, but the downside of the public editor is that became our way of dealing with the public and with criticism. It was like, don't worry, we'll deal with it. I've written 4 or 5 items and letters to readers who criticize us because now I feel like it's my job to either defend us or accept criticism. So I actually think it was the right decision.
And that brings a lot of things together, and we saw this happen this week with the Harvey Weinstein story, and you played this role where you had to describe something to the readers, and that was that a former Times reporter came forward, called me sanctimonious. I've been called a lot worse, so that was fine. No, but had said, I chased this story in 2004, the paper sat on it under pressure, and you came forward to say, okay, and people were very much ready to say, look, the Times was sitting on this. It becomes political because Harvey Weinstein was a big Democratic donor, supported Hillary Clinton, supported Barack Obama. What was your answer? Why don't you tell the crowd here what your answer was? And
so first I heard from my predecessors, from Jill Abramson and Bill Keller. Jill sent me a note in which included Bill's response, which was they did not remember this. It was 2004. And then I saw that the editor on the story, John Landman, who, by the way, was my editor when I was a young reporter and is a tough editor who loves investigative reporting, I thought Landman said she didn't have it, and then I read fully her account. She didn't have a story. These are really hard stories. I mean, I've now been deeply involved in a story about Bill O'Reilly that caused him to be forced out, and I was deeply involved in the Harvey Weinstein story. They're hard. You have to convince women to tell deeply personal stories on the record. You have to have a little bit of something else, like that there were settlements. They're tough. So I thought, it was clear to me Sharon, with respect to her, did not have the story. And I thought it was an attack on, again, my predecessors, but still an attack on the institution. So I felt compelled to say to readers, I've talked to my predecessors, and I've also dealt with Harvey Weinstein myself numerous times, including on this story. And I can tell you that it's unimaginable to me that the New York Times would have folded on a story about him. And the evidence is, we just ran 2 long stories that eventually led to his dismissal along with the New Yorker piece. That's what I said to readers.
Right. And the story came out. There's now been a flood of new allegations. It should have ripple effects. Do you expect, some people have said, now we have to look at other stories, and each, like Harvey Weinstein, there was an incident in 2015 that went public, and that's what we say, okay, what was going on there? Something was going on. The president had a lot of similar allegations, not quite as severe during the campaign, and there's been a sort of clamor, like, do you see this kind of sweeping into Washington and becoming a story you have to look at again with the President of the United States?
I think what I would say is that the combination of the famous Access Hollywood tape, along with the Roger Ailes story, the Bill O'Reilly story, and the Harvey Weinstein story, opened a window onto a kind of, attitude toward women that some powerful men displayed, including Donald Trump. I think that it sparked a conversation that is unlike anything I was expecting or have ever seen. We now hear from more and more women. I don't know whether or not, I just have no idea whether or not it sparks and it renews the discussion about, all indications are it does renew the discussion about the Access Hollywood tape and what that meant. So I don't know. But there is a much bigger conversation going on in the country about sexual harassment than there was a year ago. And I have to admit, if looking at my email, it's bigger than I expected it to be. It's huge.
I do think, and this is, I want to say this a little carefully, being a woman and speaking to lots of women, the sense that I had from women I know, regardless of whether they supported the president or not, but women who had experienced harassment in the workplace or sexual assault. And yes, it's a slippery slope, but these are different things. The growing allegations against Weinstein were really, really grotesque, for lack of a better word. The Access Hollywood tape happened. And it's funny because it was around a year ago now, so Facebook is popping up my 1-year stories from that weekend. So I'm seeing all these things that I wrote, and I wrote one story from when he was holed up in Trump Tower, and then when Paul Ryan got booed at his rally that day in Wisconsin, I asked, I don't remember which editor it was, but I asked if we could send reporters out to some swing states to see what voter reactions were, and indeed there were people who were turning against their senators for turning against Trump. If you were a woman who had experienced sexual harassment in the workplace and had struggled with people believing you, you saw this tape. The president called it locker room talk, said it did not suggest anything bigger. We obviously reported on other women who had made complaints about him. But if you were a woman who had suffered abuse of some kind, you saw that somebody was elected president despite that. And every other case that Dean mentioned, there were huge repercussions. Harvey Weinstein's life is over, effectively. He might reclaim it at some point way down the road. But, and I do think that, there's no way of knowing this, but just based on the way the conversation has gone, I think some of the degree to which women have been more willing to speak out may be a backlash to that. That there was a sense that the Access Hollywood tape is the only time I can think of in my memory when Donald Trump was humiliated. And he really was humiliated. He does not experience these things the way most people do, but he was then. And I think that the tape was graphic and it was upsetting for a lot of women, and I think that people process that as, I think there was a reaction to the fact that there was no consequence. At the end of the day, the takeaway was there was no consequence.
Right. You as a reporter experiencing that, because it seems to touch you, did it touch you personally at all yourself? Is that what you're getting at here in terms of the Access Hollywood story?
In terms of having experienced
or just in terms
issues?
of that story, did you feel as a woman, did it make you mad? And then, and how do you deal with that in anything with Trump?
Look, you have to divorce yourself from emotions on all this stuff as much as possible, but it was jarring. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It was a jarring tape to listen to.
Right, to anyone, any day.
Yeah,
right,
one of the things, so my memory of what happened, I took part, and there was a Yahoo retrospective on this recently on the 64 hours of that weekend, because that weekend really is but whatever. But that weekend is actually that weekend is when things changed. It's just the reality. He was the only time that I have actually experienced fear. I was actually just talking about this with someone backstage during the campaign. Really was not at a rally. It was when he came downstairs at Trump Tower that day. The day after the tape dropped. It was a Saturday. He came downstairs with his son Don Jr. and Kellyanne Conway, and there had been an impromptu rally in front of Trump Tower. And Trump walked out the glass doors unannounced. He just came downstairs. We were all chasing him. And he did a sort of power salute, and people were like, it was like a Juan Perón moment, and it was really, really scary, because I felt like anything could happen at that moment, because he clearly was undone. And then the next night was when he brought Bill Clinton's accusers to the debate. But But I remember getting calls from some Clinton consultants who were literally cackling about the tape on that Saturday. And all three of them said the exact same thing at the start of the conversation. I'd pick up the phone and they would say, "Aren't you loving this?" And I said, "No, I'm not loving this. What is there to love about this? This is horrible." Right. And they said, well, they'd say, "Well, you know, I'm loving this." And that was not a great reaction either. So I just think that it was an enormously upsetting period of time.
That brings me to something before we should get to questions, but look, just that anecdote you just told us how politicized everything is. Everything is so politicized. Yes. The Weinstein story became about he's a Democratic donor, just like Bill O'Reilly's conservative, and hey, that's all in the mix, but how's it for you guys and for all of us to be operating, trying to do journalism in an environment where everything is hyper-politicized so that our work can never be just about truth and mission?
Well, it can still be about truth.
I mean, into the public perception.
Yeah, it can still be about truth and mission in a hyper-politicized environment. But you're right. I mean, of course, I thought when we were editing the Harvey Weinstein story that some people would say this is a liberal icon. But I have to admit, it was like the 9th thought. I mean, the first 8 thoughts, he was a very powerful figure in Hollywood, the movies, the women. If I can say one thing about the Weinstein story, then I'll let you. I think I've been struggling to try to figure out why it resonated so much. When we edited the O'Reilly story, it didn't pop right away. I think this popped right away because the women are recognizable. Yes. I think it's the first one of these stories where it's not just to be frank, a class of unidentifiable women that don't resonate for people. I think Ashley Judd, Gwyneth Paltrow, Angelina Jolie, I think that's one. I think that changed the debate.
Powerful women who are perceived as powerful, and yet they themselves.
Yes,
and Gwyneth Paltrow and Angelina Jolie and Rosanna Arquette can be treated this way. My God, what does that say? Mm-hmm. What's the larger message of that? Right. All
right. So I think we should move to questions now, and I believe there will be a microphone going around. But I'll start with something from Facebook Live, and apparently we've had a lot of questions like this. And I'll start with Peter on this. We've heard this before. What if the press didn't cover him? What would he do? It's this thing that you hear a lot from the left.
Well, he would be president of the United States. I mean,
exactly.
It's like, he's not going to go away because we don't cover him. I mean, I don't understand that, I have to say. I don't understand that argument. Don't cover him. Don't write about the tweets. Oh, come on. So if the New York Times didn't write about the tweets, the 40 million people reading them and the other millions and more who would be retweeted would suddenly not pay attention or not care. It's a nonsense. He's a president of the United States. What he does, for good or bad, is the most central part of our coverage of the government. I mean, how can we not cover him? I don't get that.
No, and that's the definition of bias. If we decided not to cover the President of the United States, how could we get I mean, it's insane.
Yeah.
Right. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what that plays into. Correct. Both sides want us to see us as the opposition sometimes, right? And
I think there is, right. It's like what we were saying before about there are a number of people who believe that the media's job is to be the opposition party, and that is just not our job.
Yeah. Right, absolutely. This is one from Facebook Live. Karen Pierce asks, what words or actions from the executive branch would you consider a plausible threat to freedom of the press? And then what recourse does the press have?
I mean,
let's not give them ideas.
I mean, I think if this White House actually used the power of the press it would. Well, first off, the one that feels the most immediate and urgent. I mean, Jeff Sessions said that there are numerous leak investigations going on. I would be, as the leader of a news organization, appalled and go on the defensive if they were, if right now they had subpoenaed phone records or had gotten a warrant for phone records of New York Times reporters and I didn't know about it and our lawyers didn't have a chance to defend it, and if they were, wiretapping phones. That would be beyond the pale, but also not out of the question. It's not impossible. I mean, the previous administration did things that made us very uncomfortable, despite their saying more positive things about the press. So this administration makes me nervous in that regard.
Now, I don't know. Do we have a microphone in the middle here? If anyone wants to line up there, please feel free.
Hi.
Yay.
Thanks for doing this. Each of you excel in really challenging, important jobs, so thanks so much for your work. I guess my question is primarily for you, Dean, but I'd love to hear what anyone thinks. It's about World War III. So, the Times
Something light. Good.
Well,
Could we talk about
you got
tweets?
the Times,
Same thing.
Martin, great scoop, the call from Bob Corker going on the record saying he's genuinely afraid that Trump might start World War III. There's reporting that Tillerson and Mattis are talking about what to do if he orders a nuclear first strike. I mean, this feels like 1,000 times scarier than all this other stuff. And like Maggie, I'm thinking about that moment you described when he's outside Trump Tower after the tape drops and he's like truly unpredictable. I mean, we could really be on the cusp of some terrible conflict, maybe a nuclear conflict. How do you feel and how do you make calls in this ambiguous, high stakes environment about, is the New York Times, what's your role now going forward, other news outlets, to convey the stakes and the state of play about this huge, huge issue, while all this other stuff is also happening at the same time?
Over to you, Dean.
Wow. I think I don't know if I actually think we're on the verge of World War III, but I think that we're on the verge of conflicts between the United States and some of its former allies, and conflicts between the United States and countries that we've had very tense relationships with, like North Korea, that are getting more tense. I think what we have to do is what we're doing, which is not just report what the administration says, explain the stakes, use a vast foreign operation to go to the places they're talking about, get the reaction from the people there, ask hard questions about every fact and argument that the White House makes as it makes these decisions. I think that's our role, and I think that's what we're doing. I don't think it's actually helpful as a journalist, at least not in my part of the world. Maybe it is in Jim Bennett's part of the world, to scream that we're on the verge of war. I get that people feel that. First of all, I don't feel it. I think our role is to just keep explaining, prying, and using reporters, go to North Korea, go everywhere we can, and just explain the stakes.
So this is where I think the disparity between what he tweets and what is happening within the administration is probably hardest for us to explain to people, but also profoundly important. So one of the details that you just cited came from reporting by a reporter who I actually really respect. But if you actually read the sentence that he wrote about Mattis and Tillerson, he said, one source speculated this is what they have talked about, did not say this is actually what they are talking about. Might they be talking about that? Absolutely. But I don't know how responsible it is, given this climate, to be speculating on the speculation about the nuclear football.
Hello, it's a pleasure. Mr. Baker, I'd like to compliment you on your article 2 weeks ago about the president. He's not a unifier, he's a divider.
Thank you.
And Ms. Haberman, I'd like to compliment you on your article on Tuesday, profiling the Minister of Propaganda, Stephen Young Goebbels Miller.
I don't think that was me. That was my colleague, Matt Flegenheimer. I was a contributor.
A contributor from New York.
A very small contributor, but I will relay your praise to him.
My question is, if FBI Director Mueller finds culpability, and I know Trump is, we saw with the pardon of Arpaio, do you see him working with Attorney General Schneiderman in New York and trying to try these people in New York State court, which would nullify the federal pardon?
I'm sorry, Mueller, you were asking if he would work with Schneiderman?
Yes.
There is a report that he is working with Schneiderman. I think for that reason, that those charges would not be, state law would not apply in terms of a pardon there.
But he didn't not necessarily if they involve people in the White House.
No.
It's because of the investigation to Manafort.
Correct. And
What I mean, just the president's pardon power only applies to federal crimes. That's what we're talking about here. So if you committed a state crime prosecuted by a state prosecutor, the president would have no ability to do something.
and that is my understanding of this is at least part of that relationship, although I think some of it is also just the relationship between different investigative bodies. And I also think it's premature to be talking about anybody who might be pardoned or charged. So,
Thank you.
sure.
Thank you.
Hi. I have a question for any of the members of the panel. And excuse my voice, I'm getting over a cold. Are you concerned that your views of Trump, the man, may be viewed as bleeding over to your coverage of Trump, the presidency?
I mean, if I can go first. I've actually not expressed views of Trump, the man. I mean, I think you hear very cautious responses from all of us about what we think of the Trump presidency. I mean, the only thing I would say is I think the Trump presidency is extraordinarily newsworthy because he's doing a lot of newsworthy stuff. I think we work really hard and have to keep working really hard to not let our views not only not influence our news judgment, but to not let our views out in the open. I mean, I know that there's a whole body of journalism professors who think that we should, let it all hang out. None of them have actually done any journalism, as far as I can tell.
Line of the night.
I actually don't think that's. I don't think readers care what my opinion is.
Right.
I think readers want to know what this gentleman asked, which is, what's the state of the world if you believe that the world is headed toward larger conflicts and disagreements? I think that's more important than what me, another guy who, may have access to some stuff, but is just another person, and what I think. I feel strongly about that.
I agree, and I think what you've heard here tonight when we make comments about the president and his demeanor, his personality, his temperament, whatever, those are observations, I hope, rather than opinions. Those are informed by observing and reporting and talking to people who are close to him and spending a lot of time thinking about him, as opposed to personal opinions that are different. And I will say that, for my own sake, this is the fourth president I've covered. When I came on the White House, I stopped voting. I stopped doing anything that could be perceived as taking a personal position. I would tell you my own family, some of whom are actually here tonight. My parents are over here, as a matter of fact. I'm from Washington. Thank you very much. I have two cousins who go to GW, so I'm a big fan of GW. But my point is that my family would tell you that even in the privacy of our own home, you would not hear me say, this person's good, this person's bad, or whatever. At least at the very least, I restrain from trying to do that, even in the privacy of our own home, because I think it's important to stay in a zone where we are open to input and we do not come to strong personal conclusions that would prevent us from being open journalists.
I completely agree. I mean, I have three small children, one of whom is a very precocious 12-year-old who has a lot of opinions. But that's the only opinion you will hear in my house, and I don't feel like I can tell him not to have them. But I do. I spend a lot of time actually trying to understand what makes Trump tick. That's what I have spent most of my frankly, the last 6 years doing, because I first started doing this with him in 2011, and when he sort of almost ran for president, and so that is what informs my reporting. But I agree with Peter. These are, and I agree with Dean. These are observations, and these are reported observations. The only distinction I would make is I think that I do think it is important for us to explain, again, tone-free, but explain and show the ways in which this is different than other presidencies, because a lot of what we are seeing is different. And so I think that the danger is going too far to remove any sense of observation so that everything sort of fits the same frame. I think that's problematic.
Hello. Tonight we've been talking a lot about kind of the influence of a journalist and a human's opinion on the way they report things, the way they see things. And I read an article. I'm a student at George Washington. I recall seeing an article a few months ago by Politico talking about the media bubble and how a lot of jobs are concentrated on the coasts and big cities, et cetera, and that the heart, mind, and habits of news sources like the Times cannot be divorced from the ethos of the cosmopolitan city where it is produced. The article goes on to talk about how this is kind of a contributing factor to how we thought overwhelmingly Clinton would win the election, but obviously didn't happen, and everyone was shocked and stunned. So does the panel have any thoughts on that?
I have one really important thought that I always make whenever anyone asks that question, which is not to say that I don't hear the premise. She lost by 80,000 votes. I'm sorry, and she won the popular vote in 3 states. She won the popular vote, he won the Electoral College. This was not some wave that everybody missed, right? As for the rest of the question, I'm going to kick over to Dean about where we're located.
I do think that that the New York Times and the major media in general has to work really hard to not only live in our bubble, and that I do think that our location affects us, and I think we have to work really hard to. I mean, I think it's a myth, by the way, that we're all New York elites. I grew up in Louisiana. I think my late mother would be shocked to hear that people thought who did not graduate from junior high school would be shocked to hear that people think of me as a leader of the media elite. But I do think we spend too much time in New York. I think it's important to get outside of New York. And I do think I would have to admit that there have been times when I thought it hurt our coverage. That I often use religion as the example, and again, I grew up in a very religious household. But we're located for the most part in cities where overt signs of religion are rare. And when I go out in the rest of the country, overt signs of religion are pretty evident, and it's a reminder to me. We cover college football. We cover football as if the world is afraid of concussions. Last week I went to an LSU game. Right. I try to do this as often as I can, and I didn't see anybody who was worried about concussions. Hit him! So I do think we have to work hard to get out of the bubble, and I think that can be a flaw for us, the Post. It just so happens that the best media and the most powerful media are in the coast, and I think we have to be careful.
Yeah.
Can I interject? Did you do anything to rectify that post-campaign?
I did. We moved a couple reporters to the Midwest.
We had some there, though, right?
Yeah, but we moved. No, we did. But we increased.
Oh, God, you guys don't laugh. You're getting me fired.
We increased the number of reporters in the Midwest. We went on, to be frank, a little bit of a hiring spree for reporters, and with the specific intention of bringing in different kinds of reporters. We've tried to hire military veterans. We've just tried to hire different kind of reporters to have different kinds of voices. I've committed to increasing the number of people who cover religion, which I think is one of those great things. So no, we've done stuff, and we will do more.
Can I add one thing there? This was a unique election in this respect too, right? And I agree with Dean completely that we do need to get out of the bubble more. But the bubble in this case was Donald Trump's hometown, right? And the view of him in New York is really different over 30 years of knowing him as a real estate developer and then this reality TV star than the view of, I would go to Iowa and people who had seen him on The Apprentice for 14 years were like talking about him as if he was a great innovator. And they would, and I think that the Democrats missed, and I think that a lot of us in the media, myself included, missed how really branded he was going into this race, not just name ID, but that people thought of him a certain way. And that was fundamentally at odds with how he had been experienced in New York City. And so I think that was a particular tension point.
Thank you very much.
Hello. A former New York Times reporter here, Lena Williams. I retired in 2005. Hello, Dean. I'm looking at Maggie because I remembered I worked with her dad. So I'm feeling old. So
Do you have pictures of Maggie in a carriage, by any way?
Yes.
We're going to be putting those on the screen now.
This is my penance right now.
I'm so proud of the work you all are doing, but I was sitting here with my colleague from the Newspaper Guild, and what's been running through my mind is whenever this president tries to talk about fake news, he cites stories in the New York Times, the Washington Post, anonymous sources, these leaks. And I have friends, relatives, neighbors who often question journalists about the anonymous source. Who is this person? The Times, Dean, as you remembered, after the Jason Blair affair, implemented some really strict rules and ethical guidelines about anonymous sources. So you can't just say an anonymous source. It has to be a senior White House official who did not want to be identified for whatever reasons. Could you explain to this audience what we use when we're talking about anonymous sources is not just blowing in the wind.
No, that's
a good
right.
question.
Yeah.
It's a good question. And it's one we don't often do a good enough job to explain. First off, we try not to use anonymous sources. I have often gone into stories and knocked out stuff that had anonymous sources. I feel very strongly. I feel very strongly anonymous sources should not be able to have quotations. Sometimes it shows up and I reach in and take it out. I think anonymous sources should only state facts. On the biggest stories, like the Harvey Weinstein story, when we have used anonymous sources, I had to know myself about them. When we do more routine anonymous source stories, whether it's from the White House or not, senior editors have to know the names of the sources and the circumstances. We test it. We're pretty, we know who they are, and they have to have specific knowledge of stuff. We have a protocol that's pretty tough because we can't afford to get it wrong. And I think we should probably be more transparent with people about that.
You mentioned, thank you very much for your presentation, but you mentioned tonight, you sometimes would say the president is often trying to sell, or you would often say, this is what he really meant and this was the shtick. I know you don't want to be an editorial page, but when I open the paper every day, and I dealt with him when he was in real estate, and I say, oh, this is just him being him, and they should ignore this. At what point is it still reporting to interpret and say what shtick, or just to repeat? And it seems to me what I'm hearing a lot outside the editorial page is just repeating without giving an idea of, well, we should pay attention to that or we shouldn't. So I'm asking, where does reporting include giving an analysis of what it really was as being said, and whether it's important or not?
It's a great question, and I think basically every story should have that. I mean, ideally every story should help our readers try to process what they're seeing here, because that's our job. And it's our job to take, not personal opinion, but to take the wealth of our experience, Maggie's is better than anybody's, at how we should interpret what we're seeing. So I'll give you a great example. I mean, every morning, like when it's my duty week or it's Maggie's duty week and the phone starts to buzz with the morning tweets, and we'll type up the tweets, but we try, and the reason why it's important to have a White House reporter do it as opposed to some random reporter doing it is the White House reporters hopefully are going to bring to that even quick 10-minute version of the story some context, some perspective, and say, the president just said this, but his administration actually is not acting on that, or it's in reverse, it doesn't actually apply to the law. Just this week he talked about going after the tax exemption for the NFL. Well, the NFL actually, the teams don't actually have a tax exemption. The central office does, and they gave it up 2 years ago. So it's actually kind of, a moot point. It's more symbolism. So we said that in the story. So it's our job to do as much as possible, provide through facts as well as hopefully analysis that's fact-based, the context that will help people evaluate those tweets and not just give you the stenography version.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. This has been very informative. My question is if it's fair to ask about or report on the president's mental fitness for office. Maggie, you talked about that you don't want to put Trump on a couch, but at one point does that become a legitimate issue that needs to be talked about by reporters?
It's a great question that I'm going to answer without dodging it entirely. Glad Maggie's taking this question. Thanks, guys. Look, I think that he's certainly not the first president where this has come up, right? I mean, it might be the first presidency where we have seen it come up so loudly as an issue, but that's the advent of social media and a bunch of different media outlets as much as anything. I personally, and I will let others here defer if they would like, or disagree with me if they would like, but I personally believe the Goldwater rule really matters. We are not psychiatrists. I think that if the reporting goes somewhere conclusive, then I think that's a different issue. But right now, what you generally have in this area is, going back to the issue of anonymous quotes, and not in our paper on this, but other publications, writing blind-sourced stories of people saying he's unhinged, or he's this, or he's that. That's very dangerous because you have no way of assessing who's saying it, again, based on that, Or the flip side of that is you have either people who have known him over the years who have become critics talking about it, but again, they're speculating. Or you have a bunch of therapists who are
Who've not
met him or treated him, and who in any other circumstance would be saying to you, do not diagnose someone from afar. We are seeing something unprecedented with this presidency, but I don't know that it means that the president allows medical professionals to abandon what they've always done. So I think that it's certainly a legitimate issue for any president to have this evaluated, to have their capacity evaluated. But I just don't think that we have any reason to be doing it differently than the way we are now.
Great.
So we're getting the blinking light, but we're newspaper reporters born to go over deadline. So I feel like we have one more question we have to have here.
Hi, thanks so much for giving this panel. It's been really interesting and informative. So yesterday, as I'm sure you're aware of, in a meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau, Trump said, and I quote, "It is frankly disgusting that the press is able to write whatever it wants to write." So if any other president had said this, I personally feel like the media would have probably made a lot bigger deal out of it than the media has for President Trump. So would you say that in a sense the media is in fact being counterproductive by trying to normalize this behavior and not make such a big deal out of it?
I actually think the media made a big deal out of it.
Yeah, I do too.
I actually
Got a
think
lot
it
of
was pretty.
It led the Washington Post today.
Yep.
Yeah.
The New York Times editors maybe didn't give it quite as good play.
Who wrote that story?
But it was pretty prominent on the homepage most of the day. It was,
That's
We don't
where
care about
everyone's
the front
looking
page.
anyway.
it was on cable TV a lot of the day. I think we do actually. I mean, I think there is a danger in the sense that if he throws out so many kind of provocative, let's say even outrageous things over 9 months, at a certain point, do you grow inured to it? Do you start to say, well, that's not much different than what he said a month ago or the month before that? What got me about this one was both the notion that it seemed to imply that people shouldn't be free to write things what they want to write. Again, what really got me was the license thing, because that implies, or at least threatens, actual action. The use of government power to go after your perceived adversaries in the press. That's what Nixon did. He had people go after the Washington Post's television license for a television station in Florida. That, to me, is a big deal, and I think we treat it as a big deal. Having said that, what's interesting is, once again, you have him saying this in the morning, and then, instantly you have his people saying, no, nobody's doing anything like that. That's not going to actually happen. And it's in 9 months so far, we've seen a lot of talk, and that hasn't actually been backed up by action in a lot of these circumstances. In terms of the press, I think what Maggie and I were saying earlier is, we're worried about leak investigations, but in the day in, day out operation of the White House reporters, for instance, I see no less access, in fact, less than I had under President Obama. If that changes, we'll definitely report on it, and we'll let you know.
I think Peter's right, though. I mean, I think that one of the licensing comment was of a different order of magnitude. He's been doing a version of media attacks for 2 years now, and so I think that one of the lines, and I take your point completely, but I disagree, just that I think this is normalizing. I think one of the things that we have to be careful about, and it's a huge challenge for the media, and I don't mean we, the Times, I mean everybody, is, there's this great line in the movie Broadcast News, which dates me enormously, but where
I saw that at the museum.
You were waiting in line at the premiere.
Exactly. I was there earlier than he was. No, where a sort of pretty boy TV anchor put himself in a news piece, and Albert Brooks is horrified by this and says, yes, let's never forget, we're the real story, not them. And there is this resentment that people have of the media at best, a huge mistrust at worst. And so we have to be careful not to have the same level of reaction to everything. And so I think that's part of what I was saying about sort of showing people why it's different, or explaining to people why it's different, as opposed to having the reaction be the same for everything. I think in the campaign, things were at like a 9 way too often in terms of reaction. This one was different, but not everything he says is different.
Right. Sorry.
Thank you. What's disgusting is that this has to come to an end. Wow,
that was really.
Yeah. There you go. Thank you for coming.
Nice. We've done it.